October 19, 1961 marked a turning point in military history that few could have predicted. In the secret workshops of the Soviet Union's State Automotive Repair Factory, number 255 in Kolomna, a weapons designer named Vasily Gryazev stood before a prototype that would change warfare forever. The workshop smelled of gun oil and welded metal, and the concrete floor bore the scars of countless test firings. What lay before him appeared deceptively simple: a tube, a grip, a trigger mechanism, and a warhead that promised to revolutionize anti-tank combat. The man most responsible for this creation was not Gryazev himself, but rather Nikolai Makarovich, a grizzled engineer who had survived the Great Patriotic War and understood one fundamental truth: soldiers needed weapons they could actually use under fire. Makarovich had watched too many Soviet infantry units destroyed by German tanks during World War II. The anti-tank weapons of that era were cumbersome, requiring teams of men to operate, and often failed at critical moments. His obsession became creating a weapon that one soldier could carry, aim, and fire with devastating effect. The weapon that emerged from those workshops would eventually be designated the Ruchnoi Protivotankovy Granatomet, or handheld anti-tank grenade launcher. The world would come to know it simply as the RPG-7. Its genius lay not in revolutionary technology, but in brilliant simplicity. Where American and European designers created complex, expensive systems, the Soviets built something that could be manufactured in workshops with basic tools, maintained by soldiers with minimal training, and operated effectively by fighters who had never seen the inside of a military academy. According to declassified Soviet military documents referenced in the International Institute for Strategic Studies archives, the RPG-7 was designed to penetrate 12 inches of steel armor at ranges up to 500 yards. This capability meant it could destroy virtually any tank operating during the early 1960s. The weapon fired a rocket-propelled grenade with a shaped charge warhead that concentrated explosive force into a superheated jet of metal capable of burning through armor like a welding torch through butter. What made the RPG-7 truly revolutionary was its production philosophy. The Soviets manufactured the weapon in numbers that staggered Western intelligence analysts. Factories across the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact nations churned out thousands monthly. More significantly, the Kremlin authorized production licenses to allied nations across the globe. China began manufacturing copies designated the Type 69. North Korea, Egypt, Romania, and eventually dozens of other nations followed suit. By 1965, just 4 years after its introduction, the RPG-7 had spread across the communist world like wildfire. Soviet military advisors trained Allied forces from Cuba to Vietnam in its use. The weapon required minimal instruction: load the grenade into the tube, ensure the firing mechanism was armed, aim through simple iron sights, and squeeze the trigger. A conscript could learn basic proficiency in an afternoon. The weapon's true test would come not in European battlefields where strategists imagined massive tank confrontations between NATO and Warsaw Pact forces, but in the jungles, deserts, and mountains where proxy wars raged. The RPG-7 was about to prove that sophisticated armor and advanced technology could be defeated by determined fighters armed with weapons costing less than a used automobile. January 23, 1968, dawned humid and oppressive over the Vietnamese jungle near Khe Sanh, where American forces had established a combat base expecting a massive assault. Marine Lieutenant Robert Henderson commanded a mechanized unit equipped with M48 Patton tanks, steel beasts weighing 50 tons and bristling with firepower. Henderson had trained extensively on armor tactics at Fort Knox, studying German panzer operations and Soviet tank doctrine. Nothing in his training had prepared him for what guerrilla fighters could accomplish with simple tube-launched weapons. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong had received thousands of RPG-7 launchers through Soviet supply networks. Ships from Vladivostok and Chinese ports delivered crates marked as agricultural equipment that actually contained the distinctive green tubes and warheads. Soviet advisors established training camps in the Cambodian border regions, where fighters learned not just to fire the weapon, but to employ it tactically against mechanized forces. Henderson first encountered the RPG-7 during a convoy operation along Route 9. His tank platoon was providing security for supply trucks when the ambush erupted. The initial explosion came without warning, a flash of light followed by a thunderous detonation that struck the lead tank's turret. The shaped charge penetrated the armor, and superheated metal fragments ricocheted inside the crew compartment with lethal effect. 3 men died instantly. What shocked Henderson was not just the weapon's effectiveness but the tactics employed. The Vietnamese fighters had studied American armor doctrine and developed countermeasures. They positioned teams in concealed positions along likely routes, understanding that tanks were most vulnerable from the sides and rear. They fired from distances of 100 yards or less, where even hastily aimed shots could be effective, then immediately withdrew before American forces could respond. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical damage. Tank crews who had felt invulnerable inside their armored shells suddenly understood they could be killed by fighters they never saw carrying weapons that weighed less than 20 pounds. Morale deteriorated rapidly. Crew members requested transfers to infantry units, reasoning that they had better survival odds outside the steel coffins that attracted RPG fire. According to casualitative analyses later published in the Journal of Military History, the RPG-7 and its variants accounted for approximately 34% of American armored vehicle losses in Vietnam between 1968 and 1973. This figure stunned Pentagon planners who had invested billions in armor development. The economic calculation was particularly disturbing. An M48 tank cost approximately $400,000 to manufacture and deploy, while an RPG-7 launcher and grenade together cost less than $500. The Vietnamese demonstrated something that would echo through subsequent decades of warfare. Expensive, technologically sophisticated weapon systems could be defeated by cheap, widely available weapons in the hands of determined fighters who understood tactical employment. The jungle environment amplified this advantage. Dense vegetation provided concealment until the moment of firing. Poor visibility limited the effectiveness of tank optics and targeting systems. The terrain restricted tank mobility, forcing them onto predictable routes where ambushes could be prepared. By 1970, American armor doctrine had fundamentally shifted in response to the RPG threat. Tanks began operating with infantry support, specifically trained to spot and suppress RPG teams. Convoys traveled at higher speeds to reduce exposure time. Engineers developed reactive armor concepts, though these would not reach operational status until decades later. The experience in Vietnam taught a brutal lesson that military establishments worldwide would repeatedly forget and relearn. Technological superiority does not guarantee battlefield dominance. December 8, 1979, brought Soviet tanks rolling into Afghanistan through the Salang Pass, an invasion that Moscow's leadership expected to conclude within weeks. The operation deployed the Soviet Army's most modern equipment, including T-62 and T-72 tanks, armored personnel carriers, and helicopter gunships. Marshal Sergei Sokolov, commanding the invasion force, anticipated crushing Afghan resistance through overwhelming firepower and mechanized mobility. His confidence rested on the Soviet military's extensive experience with armored warfare and the assumption that poorly educated mountain fighters could not effectively challenge modern military forces. The Mujahideen who opposed the Soviet invasion initially possessed limited heavy weapons. They fought with rifles, machine guns, and whatever arms they could capture or purchase. The RPG-7, ironically a Soviet weapon, would become their most effective tool against Soviet armor. Supply networks emerged through Pakistan, funded by American and Saudi money, managed by Pakistani intelligence services. Crates of RPG-7 launchers manufactured in China, Egypt, and Romania flowed through the Khyber Pass into Afghan hands. Abdul Haq, a Mujahideen commander operating in the mountains near Kabul, understood that defeating Soviet armor required tactics adapted to Afghanistan's terrain. The narrow mountain passes and steep valleys that channeled Soviet columns into predictable routes created ideal ambush conditions. Haq trained his fighters in techniques specifically designed to exploit RPG capabilities against armored vehicles. Teams would position themselves on high ground overlooking roads, giving them clear shots at tank turrets and thinly armored engine compartments. The first major engagement where RPGs devastated Soviet armor occurred in the Panjshir Valley during spring of 1982. Soviet forces launched Operation Panjshir 5, deploying over 12,000 troops supported by tanks and armored vehicles to clear the valley of resistance forces. Ahmad Shah Massoud, the legendary Mujahideen commander defending the valley, had prepared his forces with extensive RPG training. His fighters positioned themselves on ridge lines and in prepared positions along the valley floor. When Soviet columns advanced, they encountered coordinated RPG ambushes that destroyed dozens of vehicles within hours. The shaped charge warheads proved particularly effective against the T-62 tanks that formed the armored spearhead. These tanks, though well armored by the standards of their design era, could not withstand direct hits from modern RPG-7 warheads at close range. The explosions not only penetrated armor, but often ignited ammunition storage, resulting in catastrophic detonations that killed entire crews. Soviet military journals, later examined by Western analysts after the Cold War's end, documented the psychological toll these ambushes inflicted. Tank crews developed what military psychiatrists termed acute stress reactions, manifesting as reluctance to enter narrow valleys, excessive alcohol consumption, and, in extreme cases, refusal to mount their vehicles. The knowledge that an unseen fighter with a tube launcher could destroy their tank created constant fear that eroded unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness. The Soviets attempted various countermeasures throughout the 9-year occupation. They welded additional armor plates to vulnerable areas, installed wire mesh screens designed to prematurely detonate RPG warheads, and developed tactics requiring infantry to sweep terrain before tanks advanced. None of these measures proved sufficient. The Mujahideen adapted faster than Soviet forces could respond, shifting ambush positions, targeting infantry escorts first, and concentrating fire to overwhelm defensive measures. By 1985, the Soviet General Staff privately acknowledged that they could not eliminate the RPG threat without committing forces that exceeded available resources. The weapons were too numerous, too simple to employ, and too easily replaced. For every launcher destroyed, 3 more appeared through supply networks that the Soviets could not interdict. The Afghan experience demonstrated that the RPG-7's effectiveness extended beyond its technical capabilities to encompass the strategic reality that cheap, proliferated weapons could impose unsustainable costs on even superpower militaries. October 3, 1993, brought American Rangers and Delta Force operators into the labyrinthine streets of Mogadishu, Somalia, for what planners expected would be a rapid raid to capture lieutenants of the warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid. Staff Sergeant Matt Eversman led a ranger chalk that inserted via helicopter into the Bakara Market District, one of the world's most densely populated urban areas. Intelligence assessments had identified the RPG-7 as a potential threat but significantly underestimated both the number of launchers present and the tactical sophistication with which Somali militiamen would employ them. The operation designated Gothic Serpent began at 14:30 hours local time, with helicopters inserting assault forces, while ground convoys provided support and evacuation capability. Within minutes, the tactical situation deteriorated catastrophically. Somali fighters armed with RPG-7s began engaging the helicopters using tactics they had learned from veterans of the Afghan conflict. These techniques specifically targeted the vulnerable tail rotors and engine compartments of helicopters, understanding that even near misses could cause catastrophic damage through shrapnel effects. Chief Warrant Officer 3, Michael Durant, piloted Super 6-4, a Black Hawk helicopter providing aerial observation. At approximately 15:40 hours, an RPG rocket streaked from a building and struck his helicopter's tail section. The impact severed control linkages and damaged the tail rotor assembly. Durant fought to maintain control as the helicopter spun violently, but the damage was catastrophic. Super 6-4 crashed into a neighborhood controlled by hostile militiamen, beginning a desperate rescue operation that would stretch through the night. The urban environment transformed the RPG-7 from an anti-armor weapon into a versatile tool for asymmetric warfare. Militiamen fired from windows, rooftops, and alleyways, then disappeared into buildings before American forces could respond. The dense construction provided endless firing positions and protected the shooters from return fire. American rules of engagement, designed to minimize civilian casualties, restricted the overwhelming firepower that might have suppressed RPG teams. According to detailed after-action reports compiled by the United States Army, and later analyzed in Mark Bowden's comprehensive account referenced in military journals, Somali fighters demonstrated remarkable learning capacity. They observed that American helicopters flew predictable patterns during assault operations. They noted that the aircraft flew relatively slowly while inserting or extracting troops, creating vulnerable windows of opportunity. They understood that helicopters could not maneuver effectively in confined urban airspace surrounded by tall buildings. The tactical employment of RPGs in Mogadishu revealed evolution in asymmetric warfare doctrine. Somali militiamen organized into dedicated anti-aircraft teams armed with multiple launchers and substantial ammunition stocks. They positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that helicopters would face multiple RPG launches simultaneously. This technique increased hit probability and overwhelmed aircraft defensive capabilities. The militiamen accepted that most rockets would miss their targets. Understanding that volume of fire mattered more than precision, the battle that began as a 1-hour raid extended through 18 hours of continuous combat. American forces lost 2 Black Hawk helicopters to RPG fire, with additional aircraft damaged. 18 American soldiers died, and 73 were wounded. Somali casualties numbered in the hundreds, possibly exceeding 1,000. But the disproportionate loss ratio meant little strategically. The images of American casualties being dragged through Mogadishu's streets shocked the American public and directly contributed to the decision to withdraw forces from Somalia. The Mogadishu experience forced comprehensive reassessment of helicopter vulnerability to RPG fire in urban environments. Military planners had focused primarily on sophisticated surface-to-air missiles as the primary threat to helicopters, dismissing the RPG-7 as primarily an anti-tank weapon. The battle demonstrated that any rocket-propelled weapon could threaten aircraft when employed tactically in environments that restricted aircraft maneuverability. This lesson would be relearned repeatedly in subsequent conflicts, yet the fundamental vulnerability remained unsolved. The RPG-7, designed in the early 1960s to kill tanks, had proven equally effective against the most advanced helicopters of the 1990s. March 20, 2003 initiated the American invasion of Iraq, with massive airstrikes against Baghdad and strategic targets throughout the country. Within 3 weeks, American armored forces had seized the Iraqi capital and toppled Saddam Hussein's regime. Lieutenant Colonel Eric Schwartz commanded an armor battalion equipped with M1 Abrams tanks, the most sophisticated main battle tanks ever deployed. The Abrams featured composite armor incorporating depleted uranium, advanced fire control systems, and gas turbine engines providing extraordinary mobility. Schwartz had trained extensively in desert warfare and felt confident his unit could handle any conventional threat. The initial invasion encountered sporadic RPG fire, but Iraqi military units collapsed so rapidly that anti-tank weapons posed minimal threat. The RPG-7s that Iraqi forces possessed were poorly maintained, often lacked proper ammunition, and were fired by inadequately trained conscripts more interested in survival than fighting. American casualties during the conventional phase of operations remained remarkably low, reinforcing confidence that modern armor had finally solved the vulnerabilities that had plagued earlier generations. The insurgency that emerged throughout 2004 told a different story. Iraqi resistance fighters, joined by foreign jihadists flowing across porous borders, obtained thousands of RPG-7 launchers from the massive weapons caches hidden throughout the country. Unlike the demoralized Iraqi military, these fighters were motivated, tactically innovative, and willing to accept casualties that conventional forces would find unsustainable. They studied American tactics, observed armor vulnerabilities, and developed techniques specifically designed to kill Abrams tanks. Captain James Rodriguez commanded a tank company operating in Ramadi, a city that had become an insurgent stronghold. His Abrams tanks patrolled streets where every window, doorway, and pile of rubble could conceal an RPG team. The urban terrain negated many of the Abrams' advantages. Its sophisticated fire control systems were designed for engaging targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. But in Ramadi's narrow streets, combat occurred at distances of 50 yards or less. The tank's thick frontal armor provided excellent protection, but insurgents rarely attacked from the front, instead targeting thinner side and rear armor from concealed positions. The insurgents developed what military intelligence analysts termed swarming tactics, specifically designed to overwhelm even advanced armor. Teams would position themselves at multiple locations around an intersection or along a street. When an American vehicle appeared, they would fire simultaneously from several directions, concentrating multiple RPG rockets on a single target within seconds. Even if individual hits failed to penetrate, the cumulative effect could disable vehicles by destroying external equipment, damaging tracks, or killing exposed crew members. According to data compiled by the United States Army Combat Studies Institute and referenced in military effectiveness analyses, RPG attacks accounted for significant percentages of American armored vehicle damage in urban operations throughout Iraq. The Abrams tank, while nearly impervious to frontal attacks, proved vulnerable to side and rear shots at close range. The later model, RPG-29, an advanced version of the basic RPG-7 design, featured tandem warheads specifically designed to defeat reactive armor, and proved capable of penetrating even the Abrams' sophisticated armor in certain conditions. The psychological dimension of the RPG threat manifested differently in Iraq than in previous conflicts. Abrams crews possessed confidence in their armor that earlier generations of tankers lacked, but this confidence was perpetually tested. Every patrol through urban terrain meant exposure to potential ambush. Crew members understood that while their frontal armor could stop RPG hits, a rocket striking the side turret ring, engine compartment, or ammunition storage could kill them as surely as any anti-tank missile. The constant tension eroded morale over months-long deployments. American forces adapted through multiple iterations of tactical doctrine and technological solutions. Tanks began operating with extensive infantry support trained specifically in urban combat. Engineers developed tile armor systems and reactive armor packages that provided additional protection against shaped charge warheads. Urban combat training emphasized rapid target acquisition and immediate violent response to ambushes. Yet none of these measures eliminated the fundamental vulnerability. In close urban terrain, the RPG-7 remained a lethal threat to even the world's most advanced tanks, just as it had been 40 years earlier in Vietnamese jungles. February 15, 2011 marked the beginning of what observers initially termed the Arab Spring, but what would descend into brutal civil conflicts across the Middle East. In Syria, peaceful protests against President Bashar al-Assad's government escalated into armed rebellion by summer. Opposition forces coalesced from defecting military units, civilian volunteers, and eventually foreign fighters. Their arsenals consisted primarily of weapons captured from government forces or smuggled across porous borders. Among these weapons, the RPG-7 and its variants appeared in staggering numbers, testament to decades of Soviet and Russian arms exports to Middle Eastern client states. Abu Mohammed, a former Syrian army sergeant who defected to join the Free Syrian Army, commanded a unit fighting in the devastated suburbs of Aleppo. His military training had included extensive instruction on the RPG-7, as the weapon formed the backbone of Syrian infantry anti-armor capabilities. The launcher he carried had been manufactured in 1987 at a Bulgarian factory and had probably seen service in multiple conflicts before reaching his hands. Despite its age and wear, the weapon remained functionally reliable, demonstrating the robust design philosophy that made it nearly indestructible. The Syrian conflict demonstrated the RPG-7's versatility beyond its original anti-tank role. Government forces deployed armor extensively in urban combat, using tanks as mobile artillery platforms to reduce rebel positions. The opposition responded with RPG ambushes that employed tactics refined across decades of asymmetric warfare. More significantly, fighters discovered the weapon's effectiveness against fortified positions. The shaped charge warheads, designed to penetrate tank armor, could blast through concrete walls and destroy hardened fighting positions. Rebel forces used RPGs as substitute artillery, firing at elevated angles to drop rockets onto government positions. The proliferation of smartphones and social media created unprecedented documentation of RPG employment in combat. Fighters filmed attacks and uploaded videos to YouTube, Twitter, and other platforms within hours. These videos served multiple purposes: propaganda demonstrating effectiveness against government forces, training materials showing successful tactics, and fundraising tools to attract foreign support. Military analysts worldwide studied these videos, gaining insights into how non-state actors employed anti-tank weapons in complex urban environments. Colonel Dmitry Volkov commanded a Russian mechanized unit deployed to Syria in 2015 when Moscow intervened to support Assad's government. Russian forces brought modern T-90 tanks and BTR-82 armored personnel carriers, vehicles equipped with sophisticated protection systems including reactive armor and active protection systems designed to intercept incoming projectiles. Volkov expected these systems would neutralize the RPG threat that had proven so devastating to Syrian government forces. The reality proved more complicated. While Russian active protection systems successfully intercepted some RPG rockets, the systems were not infallible. The sheer volume of RPG launchers in rebel hands meant that attackers could overwhelm defenses through massed fire. Additionally, the economic calculations remained brutally unfavorable. A T-90 tank cost approximately $4 million and required extensive logistic support. The RPG launcher and grenade that could potentially destroy it cost less than $1,000 and could be operated by a fighter with minimal training. According to assessments published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies and referenced in contemporary analyses of the Syrian conflict, both government and opposition forces accumulated vast stocks of RPG munitions. Warehouses captured by rebels contained thousands of rockets in various states of preservation. Some dated to the Soviet era, manufactured in the 1970s and 80s, yet remained functional due to the weapon's simple, robust design. This longevity meant that weapons manufactured decades earlier continued killing in contemporary conflicts. The Syrian civil war also revealed the global supply networks that kept RPG-7s flowing to conflict zones. Despite international arms embargoes and interdiction efforts, launchers and ammunition reached Syrian fighters through multiple channels. Turkey's porous southern border permitted smuggling networks to operate. Iraqi weapons stocks, looted after the American invasion, filtered westward. Gulf states with strategic interests in Syria's outcome quietly facilitated weapons shipments. The RPG-7's ubiquity and the existence of production facilities in multiple countries made effective supply interdiction nearly impossible. By 2020, after nearly a decade of conflict, Syria's cities bore testament to the RPG's destructive capacity. Aleppo, Homs, and Damascus suburbs showed systematic destruction where fighting had been most intense. The weapon designed to kill tanks had contributed to reducing urban areas to rubble, demonstrating a brutal versatility that its original designers likely never anticipated. November 7, 2020, brought renewed attention to the RPG-7 when warfare erupted between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region. This conflict, though geographically confined, would demonstrate how modern technology interacted with weapons designed in the Cold War era. Azerbaijani forces deployed sophisticated Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 drones equipped with precision-guided munitions, while Armenian defenders relied heavily on Soviet-era equipment, including extensive stocks of RPG-7s and more advanced RPG-29 variants. Major Armen Grigoryan commanded an Armenian mechanized infantry company, dug into defensive positions in the mountainous terrain. His unit possessed a mix of equipment spanning 4 decades: T-72 tanks from the 1980s, BTR-80 armored personnel carriers, and crates of RPG launchers manufactured in facilities from Russia to China. Grigoryan had trained on these weapons during mandatory military service and understood both their capabilities and limitations. Against Azerbaijani armor advancing through mountain passes, the RPGs would be devastatingly effective. Against drones circling at 15,000 feet, they were useless. The Azerbaijani offensive combined drone strikes with armored advances, creating tactical dilemmas that Armenian forces struggled to resolve. Drones identified and destroyed Armenian armor and artillery with precision strikes, eliminating the heavy weapons needed to stop mechanized assaults. When Azerbaijani tanks advanced, they encountered RPG teams that had survived the drone strikes. The resulting engagements demonstrated that while technology had advanced dramatically since the RPG-7's introduction, the fundamental physics of shaped charge warheads penetrating armor remained unchanged. The conflict also saw extensive documentation through both official military channels and civilian observers with smartphones. Videos emerged showing Armenian fighters engaging Azerbaijani tanks at close range with RPG-7s, some attacks successful, others ending with the shooter's death from return fire. These recordings provided unprecedented insights into modern anti-tank combat, revealing both the weapon's lethality and its significant risks. Effective RPG employment required fighters to position themselves within 200 yards of their targets, accepting exposure to machine gun fire, artillery, and supporting infantry. International observers, including military attachés from NATO nations, studied the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict intensely for lessons applicable to potential future conflicts. The fighting demonstrated that the RPG threat persisted even in an era of drone warfare and precision munitions. While high-technology weapons dominated the battlefield at operational and strategic levels, at the tactical level where individual soldiers fought and died, weapons designed 6 decades earlier remained highly relevant. February 24, 2022, brought these lessons to horrifying prominence when Russian forces invaded Ukraine in an operation that Moscow expected to conclude within days. Russian armored columns advanced on Kyiv from Belarus, confident that overwhelming force would rapidly collapse Ukrainian resistance. President Vladimir Putin and his military leadership had studied decades of asymmetric conflicts, but apparently drew the wrong conclusions. They understood that insurgents with RPGs could threaten tanks, but believed that conventional military forces employing combined arms tactics could mitigate these threats. The initial Russian advance encountered Ukrainian forces armed with a combination of Western-supplied anti-tank missiles, including Javelin and NLAW systems, and enormous stocks of Soviet-era RPG-7s and RPG-29s. The Javelin missiles received extensive media attention for their effectiveness, but the simpler RPGs accounted for significant numbers of Russian armored vehicle kills, particularly in urban and close terrain, where their shorter range mattered less. Lieutenant Oleksandr Kovalenko commanded a Ukrainian territorial defense unit fighting in the suburbs of Kyiv. His soldiers included veterans of the conflict in eastern Ukraine that had simmered since 2014, civilians who had undergone hasty military training, and volunteers from across Ukrainian society. Their heavy weapons consisted primarily of RPG launchers, some dating to the Soviet era, others more recent production from Eastern European factories. Kovalenko's men had trained in basic infantry tactics and specifically in anti-tank ambush techniques adapted from multiple previous conflicts. The fighting in Kyiv's suburbs revealed tactical patterns that would have been familiar to soldiers in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria. Russian armored columns advanced along roads, constrained by terrain and the need to maintain formation. Ukrainian defenders positioned themselves in buildings overlooking these routes, in tree lines providing concealment, and in prepared positions allowing rapid engagement and withdrawal. They waited until Russian vehicles were within optimal range, typically 100 yards or less, then fired multiple RPGs simultaneously to overwhelm any defensive measures. According to analyses published by military research organizations including the Royal United Services Institute and referenced in assessments of the conflict, Ukrainian forces destroyed hundreds of Russian armored vehicles during the first weeks of the invasion. While Western-supplied anti-tank missiles accounted for a significant percentage of these kills, RPGs and other short-range weapons contributed substantially. The psychological impact on Russian forces proved severe. Tank crews who had expected rapid victory instead found themselves in grinding urban combat where every building could conceal an anti-tank team. May 12, 2022 found defense analysts worldwide reassessing fundamental assumptions about armor and anti-tank warfare as images of destroyed Russian tanks flooded social media. Dr. Michael Chen, a researcher at the RAND Corporation specializing in military cost-effectiveness analysis, sat in his office reviewing data that painted a disturbing picture for nations that had invested heavily in armored forces. The numbers told a story that military establishments had resisted acknowledging for decades. The economic imbalance between tanks and the weapons that destroyed them had grown increasingly unsustainable. A modern main battle tank represented an extraordinary investment. The American M1A2 Abrams cost approximately $9 million per unit, not including the extensive logistics infrastructure required to maintain and deploy it. The Russian T-90, less sophisticated but still a capable platform, cost approximately $4 million. These prices reflected decades of engineering refinement, sophisticated armor composites, advanced fire control systems, and powerful engines. Armies purchased tanks in small quantities, typically dozens rather than thousands, due to budgetary constraints. In contrast, an RPG-7 launcher and rocket together cost between $500 and $1,000, depending on manufacturer and market conditions. This represented a cost ratio of roughly 10,000 to 1 when comparing an Abrams tank to the weapon that could destroy it. Even accounting for the fact that most RPG shots missed their targets, the economic calculation favored the anti-tank weapon overwhelmingly. A defender could afford to fire dozens of RPG rockets at an attacking tank and still come out ahead economically if they achieved a single kill. The proliferation of RPG manufacturing capacity worldwide ensured that supply would never constrain availability. Russia continued producing RPG-7s and advanced variants at state factories. China manufactured both direct copies and improved versions designated Type 69 and Type 85. Egypt, Romania, Pakistan, and numerous other nations operated production lines. Illicit manufacturing in conflict zones added to the global supply. United Nations estimates, though necessarily imprecise, suggested that tens of millions of RPG launchers existed worldwide, with hundreds of millions of rockets in storage or circulation. Professor Sarah Whitmore of King's College London had spent 2 decades studying arms proliferation patterns. Her research, published in multiple peer-reviewed journals and referenced in policy discussions, documented how the RPG-7 had become possibly the most widely distributed weapon system in human history, aside from small arms. The weapon's simplicity enabled not just state-level production, but also workshop-level manufacturing in regions with minimal industrial infrastructure. Insurgent groups, terrorist organizations, and criminal cartels could maintain and operate RPGs indefinitely without sophisticated supply chains. The strategic implications troubled military planners confronting the reality that expensive armored forces faced persistent vulnerability to cheap weapons that could never be eliminated from the battlefield. Various technological solutions had been proposed and implemented over the decades. Reactive armor, explosive tiles mounted on vehicle exteriors that detonated to disrupt incoming shaped charges, provided some protection, but added weight, and could be overwhelmed by tandem warheads. Active protection systems that detected and intercepted incoming projectiles showed promise, but remained expensive, complex, and imperfect. The Israeli Trophy Active Protection System, installed on Merkava tanks and some American Abrams, represented the most advanced defensive technology fielded in combat. The system used radar to detect incoming projectiles and fired interceptors to destroy them before impact. Trophy had achieved multiple confirmed intercepts of RPG rockets in combat, validating the concept. However, each Trophy system cost several $100,000, and the technology faced inherent limitations. Swarm attacks with multiple simultaneous RPG launches could overwhelm the system's capacity to engage threats. Additionally, the interceptors themselves posed dangers to nearby friendly infantry. General Mark Patterson, retired from the United States Army after serving as Armor Branch Chief, spoke candidly in a 2023 interview with Defense News about the persistent RPG threat. According to Patterson, the military establishment had invested enormous resources in defeating anti-tank weapons, but could never fully solve the problem because the physics favored the offense. A shaped charge warhead concentrating explosive energy into a focused jet would always pose threats to armor. Making tanks heavy enough to defeat all possible shaped charge attacks would create vehicles too heavy to be strategically mobile, or too expensive to field in meaningful numbers. The uncomfortable truth that emerged from decades of combat experience was that the RPG-7's effectiveness stemmed not from technological sophistication, but from fundamental strategic factors that technology alone could not overcome. The weapon's low cost enabled mass proliferation. Its simplicity meant it required minimal training and maintenance. Its effectiveness at close range meant that in urban terrain, complex vegetation, or mountainous areas where engagement distances were naturally short, it could threaten even the most advanced armor. Most importantly, its ubiquity meant that every conflict, every insurgency, every armed group anywhere in the world had access to weapons capable of destroying armored vehicles. August 19, 2023, brought military technologists together at the International Armored Vehicles Conference in London to discuss the future of ground combat in an era where anti-tank weapons had become so widely proliferated that traditional armor concepts faced fundamental challenges. Colonel James MacArthur, representing the British Army's Armoured Corps, presented findings from recent combat studies that suggested military doctrine needed radical revision rather than incremental technological improvements. The conference highlighted a paradox that military establishments struggled to resolve. Armies continued investing billions in ever more sophisticated main battle tanks while simultaneously acknowledging that these vehicles faced persistent vulnerability to weapons costing a fraction of their price. The Russian military's struggles in Ukraine had made this paradox impossible to ignore. Russian tank losses exceeded 1,000 vehicles within 18 months of the invasion, many destroyed by RPGs or other short-range anti-tank weapons rather than sophisticated systems like the Javelin. Defense contractors presented various solutions attempting to address the RPG threat through technology. BAE Systems demonstrated a new generation of reactive armor that used electric pulses to disrupt shaped charges. Rheinmetall showcased advanced active protection systems with claimed capability to intercept multiple simultaneous threats. General Dynamics proposed tanks with modular armor packages that could be configured for different threat environments. Each solution promised to reduce vulnerability, but none could eliminate the fundamental problem that a determined enemy with sufficient RPG launchers could eventually achieve kills through volume of fire. Dr. Elena Vorontsova, a Russian military analyst who had defected to the West after the Ukraine invasion, provided sobering insights into how Russian doctrine had failed to adequately account for RPG threats. Speaking at the conference, she explained that Russian military theorists had assumed that combined arms tactics with infantry screening armored advances would adequately suppress anti-tank teams. Combat experience demonstrated this assumption's fatal flaws. Infantry could not effectively suppress defenders using RPGs in urban terrain because the defenders possessed too many advantages: intimate knowledge of the terrain, ability to fire and immediately withdraw into buildings, and willingness to accept casualties that professional militaries found unsustainable. The evolution of RPG ammunition had also complicated defensive efforts. The original RPG-7 rocket, designated PG-7, could penetrate approximately 12 inches of steel armor. By 2020, advanced warheads like the PG-7VR featured tandem charges specifically designed to defeat reactive armor. The first charge detonated the reactive armor tile, and a millisecond later, the main charge struck the now exposed base armor. These advanced rounds could threaten even heavily protected vehicles, erasing much of the protection advantage that reactive armor provided. Captain Jennifer Morrison of the United States Marine Corps presented research on how her service was adapting to the persistent RPG threat through doctrinal changes rather than technological solutions alone. The Marines had studied combat footage from Ukraine, Syria, and other recent conflicts to identify patterns in successful RPG attacks and develop countermeasures. Her findings emphasized several key factors: speed of movement to reduce target exposure time, varying routes to prevent predictable patterns that enabled ambush preparation, extensive use of smoke to obscure enemy observation, and integration of drones to identify potential ambush positions before vehicles entered danger areas. Morrison's research also highlighted the human dimension of RPG combat that technology could not address. Effective anti-tank ambushes required fighters willing to position themselves extremely close to their targets, accept high risk of death from return fire, and maintain discipline to wait for optimal firing opportunities. These factors meant that while virtually every armed group could acquire RPG launchers, not all could employ them effectively. Training, motivation, and leadership qualities significantly influenced tactical outcomes. The conference discussions revealed growing recognition that the era of tank dominance that had characterized warfare since World War I might be ending. Not because tanks had become obsolete, they still provided valuable capabilities including protected firepower and mobility, but because the cost-exchange ratio had become so unfavorable that sustaining large armored forces made decreasing strategic sense. Some analysts suggested that future ground forces would emphasize lighter, cheaper vehicles that could be lost without catastrophic economic consequences, combined with extensive anti-tank capabilities to threaten enemy armor. Lieutenant General Patrick O'Reilly, representing NATO's Armored Forces Command, pushed back against suggestions that tanks were becoming obsolete. He argued that reports of armor's death had been premature multiple times throughout history, citing predictions after World War I that machine guns had made cavalry obsolete, predictions after World War II that nuclear weapons had made conventional forces irrelevant, and predictions after Vietnam that helicopters were too vulnerable to ground fire. O'Reilly maintained that armor would continue evolving, incorporating better protection, improved situational awareness, and integration with other capabilities like drones and infantry. Yet even O'Reilly acknowledged the fundamental challenge that the RPG-7 represented. The weapon had survived 6 decades of technological change, multiple attempts to make it obsolete through armor improvements, and deployment environments ranging from Vietnamese jungles to Syrian cities. Its simplicity, low cost, and effectiveness at close range created a persistent threat that no amount of technology could fully eliminate. The dark reason the RPG-7 continued killing tanks was not that it was particularly sophisticated, but rather that it was simple enough to manufacture anywhere, cheap enough to proliferate everywhere, and effective enough to threaten armor in the close-range environments where much modern combat occurred. December 10, 2024 found Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson conducting training at Fort Benning, Georgia, instructing new armor crews on threat awareness and survival tactics. Thompson had served 3 combat deployments spanning Iraq, Afghanistan, and advisory missions in Africa. He had survived 2 RPG ambushes during his deployments, experiences that left him with profound respect for the weapon's lethality and the importance of proper tactical discipline. The soldiers before him, fresh from basic training and armor school, listened as Thompson described the distinctive sound of an RPG launch. A sharp crack, followed by the whoosh of the rocket motor igniting. Thompson's training emphasized lessons learned across 6 decades of combat. Never stop moving in danger areas. Never establish predictable patterns. Always maintain situational awareness, watching for potential firing positions. Work closely with infantry to clear potential ambush sites. Use smoke extensively to break enemy observation. Accept that perfect protection was impossible, and that survival often depended on denying the enemy optimal firing opportunities. These lessons had been written in blood across battlefields from Southeast Asia to Eastern Europe, each generation of soldiers relearning truths that previous generations had paid dearly to discover. The weapon that Thompson warned his students about had changed remarkably little since its introduction in 1961. While ammunition had evolved with more effective warheads and improved reliability, the basic launcher remained essentially unchanged. This longevity reflected brilliant initial design that anticipated exactly how infantry would need to employ anti-tank weapons under combat conditions. The RPG-7's designer, Nikolai Makarovich, who had died in 1998 at age 76, had created something that transcended the specific technological context of the early Cold War to address fundamental requirements that remained constant across decades. Dr. Raymond Foster, a military historian at the United States Army War College, had spent years studying the RPG-7's impact on warfare and military development. His forthcoming book, The Democratization of Anti-Tank Warfare, argued that the RPG-7 represented a pivotal moment in military technology, the point at which infantry acquired reliable capability to defeat armored vehicles without requiring expensive, complex weapon systems. According to Foster's analysis, this capability fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of warfare by enabling even poorly equipped forces to threaten armored formations that had previously been nearly invulnerable to infantry attack. Foster's research traced the weapon's proliferation through multiple pathways. Soviet military aid during the Cold War distributed RPG-7s to allied nations and insurgent movements worldwide. Chinese production created a parallel supply stream that continued after the Soviet Union's collapse. Licensed production in nations from Egypt to North Korea ensured that manufacturing capacity existed on multiple continents. Captured weapons changed hands repeatedly, with launchers manufactured in the 1970s still appearing in combat footage from contemporary conflicts. This proliferation meant that the RPG-7 had become a permanent feature of the global security environment, impossible to eliminate through arms control or interdiction efforts. The economic implications extended beyond simple cost comparisons between tanks and RPG launchers. Nations investing in armored forces faced ongoing expenses for training, maintenance, fuel, and replacement. A tank battalion represented not just the purchase cost of the vehicles, but the entire logistics infrastructure required to keep them operational. In contrast, RPG-equipped infantry required minimal support beyond ammunition supply. This asymmetry meant that insurgent groups, militias, and even terrorist organizations could field effective anti-tank capabilities, while nation-states struggled with the burdens of maintaining expensive mechanized forces. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen of the United States Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group had studied how American forces might confront future adversaries employing RPG swarm tactics, coordinated ambushes using dozens of launchers simultaneously to overwhelm active protection systems and reactive armor. Her classified assessments, discussed in general terms at professional forums, suggested that no current or near-future technology could fully defend against determined enemies willing to accept casualties and equipped with sufficient launchers. The physics and economics simply favored the offense too strongly. This reality forced military planners to confront uncomfortable questions about the future of armored warfare. If tanks remained vulnerable to cheap, widely available weapons, did heavy investment in armor still make strategic sense? Various nations explored different answers. Some emphasized active protection systems despite their limitations. Others focused on lighter, cheaper armored vehicles that could be lost without catastrophic consequences. Some investigated autonomous and robotic systems to remove crews from vulnerable vehicles. None of these approaches fully solved the fundamental problem that the RPG-7 embodied. A simple weapon, employed by determined fighters at close range, could defeat sophisticated armor. As 2025 approached, the RPG-7 remained in service with military and paramilitary forces in more than 100 nations. New production continued at state factories and in workshop facilities. Ammunition stockpiles numbered in the tens of millions of rounds. The weapon that Soviet engineers had designed 64 years earlier to counter NATO tanks had evolved into something far more significant, a symbol of how simplicity, proliferation, and effective tactical employment could neutralize technological superiority. The dark reason the RPG-7 continued killing tanks was not a single factor, but rather a convergence of elements that created a weapon system nearly impossible to defeat comprehensively. Its mechanical simplicity meant it required minimal training and could be maintained with basic tools. Its low cost enabled mass proliferation that made elimination through interdiction impossible. Its effectiveness at close range remained relevant because combat frequently occurred in urban, mountainous, or vegetated terrain where engagement distances naturally favored short-range weapons. Most fundamentally, the shaped charge physics that concentrated explosive energy into armor-penetrating jets remained as effective in 2025 as in 1961, immune to the passage of time and the advance of technology. Sergeant Thompson concluded his training session with a final warning to the young armor crews. The greatest danger they would face came not from sophisticated enemy weapon systems, but from an old weapon in the hands of a patient, disciplined fighter who understood how to use terrain, concealment, and tactical surprise. That weapon, designed before their parents were born, would remain a lethal threat throughout their military careers. Survival required constant vigilance, sound tactics, and the humility to respect an enemy armed with simple but effective weapons. The lesson had been learned and forgotten repeatedly across decades of warfare. Perhaps, Thompson hoped, this generation would remember.